Incel stands for involuntarily celibate. So these are men, in short, who aren't having sex and believe that as men in our society, they are owed sex, that it's their birthright. And they blame women very specifically and vitriolically for denying them sex. They tend to believe almost universally in taking away all of women's rights, in women being very much objects passed to men for their sexual gratification. And they are furious that women aren't having sex with them, to the extent that they believe in a day of retribution or a great kind of reckoning where incels around the world will rise up and murder women in retribution for the fact that they haven't slept with them.
This video is part of a series where I will be fact-checking a number of claims that Laura Bates has made about the men's human rights movement in her book, Men Who Hate Women. And in this abridged segment from my main review of that book, I invite you to consider the credibility of two highly significant claims asserted by Bates in the very first chapter. Specifically, her claim to have infiltrated and spent a significant amount of time interacting with and learning about the incel community, and her subsequent assessment and assertion that incels believe that women owe them sex. And to do all of this most effectively, I want to begin by considering the highly emotive words that she deploys at the very start of chapter 1. Since they deserve to be raped, I cannot concern myself with the pain rape causes them. To clarify, after establishing how she infiltrated various online incel message boards and interacted with other users masquerading as a shy young man, Bates goes on to describe how she witnessed her anonymous peers partaking in casual conversations about matters such as the statistical probability of getting away with rape and whether rape should in fact be made legal. She observes that one rationalization expressed is that it is women's fault that men rape women because they are driven to rape in the first place because women refuse to provide them with sex. A perspective which, by the way, helpfully reflects a popular perception that has been pushed about incels, namely that they are men who believe women literally owe them sex. She then expands on the quote that she chose as the epigraph for her very first chapter by explaining that it was another typical post that she witnessed during her interactions online. The full quote reads as follows: "My concern for level of pain of rape would be greater if it weren't for the fact that most American women deserve to be raped because they oppose prostitution as a sexual outlet for men. Since they deserve to be raped, I cannot concern myself with the pain rape causes them." Now, to be clear, I have yet to spend any time whatsoever following Bates into the murky world of incel chat rooms, and I'm certainly prepared to believe that some of the people in those chat rooms can and do say some extremely reprehensible things. Nevertheless, a cursory online search for Bates's specific quote establishes that, at least according to the website Fundies, or fundamentalists say the darndest things, it is currently considered to be the 7th most stupid thing ever said in the entire history of the internet. And while it can indeed be traced back to a discussion board called loveshy.com, which could indeed not unreasonably be perceived to have been populated by incels before it was shut down, the post in question actually dates back to 2010. Now, obviously, this one revelation alone doesn't discredit Bates's entire thesis, but it does at least strike me as rather curious that she would choose to start a book about her own personal journey into the manosphere with a quote that turns out to date back to a time when she was still pursuing her blink and you'll miss it career as a professional actress. Anyway, I'll consider her claims about incels in more detail in a later video, and one of the people that I've talked to about this community is British Badger Belle Natty, who produced the excellent 2-part documentary Interview with an Incel. When we last caught up, I asked Natty about Bates's perception that incels are men who believe that women owe them sex.
I would say that the majority of the incel community do not feel like women owe them sex. They do not feel entitled to sex with said women. They are just angry that they are not considered for sex at all by pretty much most or any women.
Okay.
And then eventually this anger and resentment comes out online. And then what you'll find is that other guys who have maybe been through this process already then start trying to talk to them and maybe mentor them in some kind of way. And there has been a lot of, what would you call it? Just they self-regulate. I don't think she would be like, oh my gosh, that doesn't happen at all. But I've seen it for myself. Okay, I've spoken to numerous incels who will talk about, you know, the anger that they may feel as a man who is just not considered to be attractive by anyone. Okay, yeah. They express their anger, and then sometimes, you know, they start to go, okay, you know what, this is probably not a good. It's probably not a good way to go to keep being stuck in this cycle of anger. Okay, yeah. And then they start to address their issues, and then other incels will then start to talk to them. Okay, and I actually think that those kinds of forums and communities should exist, and I don't think that they should be censored, because if you start to censor them, which they have been censored, but you censor them even more, right? And say you're not allowed to express genuine anger and hate, okay? Yeah. And go away. Right, we don't want you here. We don't want you to express anything of the sort. Yeah. Right. What I don't know what you think those guys are going to do, because if they, she's essentially saying that if they go and see a therapist, for example, that therapist, if they're designated as a potential terrorist, that therapist may have a responsibility to then report them to Prevent or a similar scheme. Yeah. All right. And I know incels this has happened to, by the way. So it is actually already happening, you know. And so where do they go? Where do they turn? It's essentially saying that any feelings of anger about the situation that they may be in, right? None of it is legitimate, okay, as in the sense that we all have moments where we feel angry about something or someone, and we will say, oh, I just want that person to suffer, right? Sure. But how many times, 99% of the time, people will, again, when they calm down and they say, well, you know what, genuinely, I don't actually want that person to suffer. I'm just particularly angry at the moment. And, you know, what I'm trying to say is that as a society, we already regulate this kind of behavior with everyone, right? Yeah. And it seems like feminists and women are allowed to express genuine anger and genuine hate in various ways, because feminists say that they are completely harmless, right? And they don't do anything to harm others at all, right? Yeah. But with men, any inch, like suspicion of a threat or raised voice or something.
The thing that really disgusts me about Bates's incel narrative is that, in my humble subjective opinion, she is preying on some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people in society for the express purpose of exploiting and, dare I say it, culturally appropriating their identity for her own exploitative propaganda purposes. Richard, for example, the young man that Natty interviewed for her documentary, is someone who lives with a long list of limiting conditions, including Asperger's, dyspraxia, hyperthyroidism, sickle cell, kidney disease, hyperglycemia, and a level of intellectual disability, which legally requires him to declare any relationship he might be so lucky to have, so that a professional third party can assess whether it should be allowed. Having personally spent some time with Richard, I'd say he's an extremely unlikely candidate for domestic terrorism, and also that it's not my place to dismiss his belief that he is unlikely to achieve a loving relationship with a woman in his limited lifetime. The intimacy and benefits of a loving relationship, including sex, are obviously and absolutely not a universal human right. But the ambition to achieve such an experience has just as obviously long since been recognised as an almost universal human desire and human need. Again, in my humble subjective opinion, for Bates to be so disingenuous, or at the very least ignorant, about the distinction between these two very distinct realities, says something very significant about her own perception of men. Despite her apparent in-depth interactions, Bates appears to have also failed to notice any threads discussing the sexual abuse that many of the boys and men who self-identify as incel claim to have experienced, or the fact that a high proportion of the perpetrators named are in fact female. I mean, what Laura Bates is doing is drawing a line, or joining dots between incels and individuals who've identified as incels who have been involved in mass shootings. He's joining dots all the way from, the kind of the most extreme and very kind of what I would suggest would be kind of very rare examples, even based on some of the quotes that she's collected.
Yeah, but what she doesn't know in her research is the majority of those men have had very serious, basically incestuous relationships with their mothers. And if you look at the case of the man who shot all those young girls, all boys and girls in Norway, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But basically, when he was 4 years old, he was in a special clinic with his mother because of her attitude towards him and her sexual advances towards him. They were worried about him.
Wow.
What happened is that they lost the papers. They were discharged, and they lost the papers, so they lost the trail.
Okay.
This again and again. Just recently here, we've had a series about the murderer Dennis Nielsen, who murdered 18 young men.
Yeah.
What didn't come out in that, and I know for a fact because the man who was on my committee of my refuge, Dr. Jim McKeith, was also on that trial, and he told me, and it's probably somewhere, but it wasn't ever used, that he was in bed with his mother until he was 15.
Okay.
Then his mother took a lover. And you find, if you trace back, a lot of cases of rape and also of serial killers.
Yeah.
So, but before you start making those statements, you have to do your research.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.